I'm now going to open up for questions, and I'm going to ask my friend Kate first if she still wants to clarify or has a new question. What I'm going to say is that we have an incredibly knowledgeable audience here. I know that just by looking around. So please, we want to try to get in as many questions as possible. Ask a question, and if you have a comment that you're trying to disguise as a question, just make it brief. We also have a number of things coming in online as well, so I'm going to go back and forth. But let's take a couple of questions from the audience. I'll ask the panelists to pay attention, respond to what you want, and then we'll go to another round. And please wait for the microphone as my final request.
It's Kate Clark from the Afghanistan Analyst Network. So my request for clarification was you talked about tax differentiating between sectors, military and aid or something like that in your initial presentation, which I didn't catch.
Yeah, I mentioned that both military and development aid was exempt from tax.
Fine. Okay, thank you.
Which was considerable amounts of money.
Yeah. So my other question, you said we can't wait for service delivery. Or you can't make people wait for service delivery, right? Now, right.
Can't wait for institution to be built and deliver services.
Okay. As I remember in 2001, 2002, I might have been one of the few people there who thought that the aid onslaught was a desperately bad mistake at the time of the Tokyo conference when everyone was talking about putting aid into Afghanistan. And it seemed to me that if you don't sort out security in the country, it doesn't matter how much aid you give to it, it's not going to work. And the number of what people seem to be upset about on the ground was the commanders who'd taken over their local area. It wasn't about setting up schools. They actually wanted the international powers to deal with the security. But what happened was you had an aid influx that actually built up those men's power. And that's what we're left with. We're left with a state that where ex-armed men have an awful lot of power. They've benefited from the aid, and we have an extreme example of rentier dependency. So you may say you can't make people wait, but actually at some time the money will be switched off because Afghanistan doesn't have the capacity to fund its own schools and clinics.
Okay, so good. Yeah, well, I'm going to take that. We're going to take...
Sorry,
No, there was a question-ish element to it. This woman in the front row, please.
Yeah. Rahela Siddiqui, the Director of Farkhunda Trust for Afghan Women's Education. First of all, I'm thankful to Nematullah and all our presenters for their excellent presentation and the brilliant book. My suggestion, Nematullah, is about the place of the citizens. How do you place the citizens as a key player of development process? Also in the process of in the capacity building process and in delivery, service delivery process, where do you place them to increase the accountability of the government as well?
That's a great question. I'm going to go with the gentleman just behind her. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Jawed Nadir from BUG, which is a British and Irish agencies Afghanistan group. My question is partly what Rahila John asked. We spoke a lot about state building. We didn't speak nation building. We didn't even mention the word nation building at all. I mean, a lot of people would argue that in fragile states like Afghanistan, one need to be pragmatic. Whether, I mean, a black cat or a white cat, as long as it catches the mice, it's a good cat, right? And whether NGOs or the state create healthy, resilient citizens, I mean, it doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, those citizens will continue to live in that country, and what you need to focus is on creating security. So what do you think about that?
Great. So we've got 3 questions. I'm going to throw back to the panel. I will summarize as, should you give aid until the security situation is sorted out? How are citizens really able to be involved in demanding and holding government accountable? And then this broader question of nation building. It's not just about institutions, but it's about a large cultural surround of things. So first to you, Nemat.
Yeah, thank you. And I should mention, I'm so delighted to see some of my old colleagues and friends in here, Rahila John, Mr. Nader, Isar, and others. we have worked together in Afghanistan, and I learned from them. In regard to the question of security and aid, Afghanistan is very complex, fragmented. It's not equally insecure and equally secure. Bamyan is very secure, the center part, but south is not as secure as Bamyan is or other parts of the country. In terms of the question, I will be quick on that. The way aid was delivered, so the argument was that development intervention will help to improve the security situation. But that created perverse incentives in those areas which were secure, and it created a sense of, okay, we should create some types of insecurity so that we can get funding. So that was one of a dilemma. In terms of the question of the role of citizens in Afghanistan, I go back to what we were doing in Afghanistan, Royal John. So we were part of that process, building these community forums, out of which the National Solidarity Program emerged. One of the most successful programs in Afghanistan and among other countries in a similar situation. So what the process is that locals are engaged from the very beginning, design, implementation, and monitoring of the projects at the local level. So people would come together to select their representatives, men and women. They had their own councils. And we didn't have any report of like corruption, major corruption, waste through this process. And also it brought the state and citizens together. And I would call it as the only platform that, among others, that people trusted. Coming to the nation building question, yeah, that's a major issue. And especially in situations of fragility, without having a common identity, identifying common interests among different segments of the society, or having inclusive institutions that anyone can see themselves, state building will be so difficult. So we cannot neglect that. But as far as my research here is concerned, so the focus of the research was on building the capacity of the state.
Ashley, were you able to hear those questions?
Yeah, indeed, and they're tough to respond to. I mean, these are really complex questions. Jawad's question about nation building sort of grabs me. I mean, because that's one thing that the donor community and outsiders cannot possibly do. That is an essential part of security long term, and a viable state in Afghanistan is to have a national identity around which all Afghans can coalesce, and that process of what Afghanistan means is still happening, but that is a uniquely Afghan task to figure out. And I think we see the symptoms of how difficult that is in what Nemat just talked about, and what Kate also talked about, the idea that, institution building and even small little aid projects are simple, the desire for protection from nefarious actors in a community that can just come in and do whatever they like, that's held hostage to the networks that you have to ally yourself with, because there are no real durable institutions. You have to seek protection, you have to seek resources through individuals and relationships, and that's still very much the case, and perhaps increasingly so as things become more contentious and more insecure.
It's hard. Both nation building, state building have historically been violent processes, but all we care in the international community is about boundaries on a map that we don't want to change. A very pragmatist person would say, let's forget about the boundaries, let whatever groups are in Afghanistan build their own states. But that's not how we work. So either we, the international community, violently, coercively impose a version of the nation, a version of the state, or we try to stabilize some of the violence that's happening at the moment. But it is, again, as Ashley mentioned, that's something for Afghans to decide for the most part.
We have an interesting question coming in from Nepal. Mr. Yubraj Basnet asks that a fragile country is not in a position to bargain or demand on sectoral investment while international and non-government agencies run a kind of parallel government for development. Please throw some light on managing transparency and accountability to improve this. Something that you talked about, but thinking practically about what it's like to live in the real world of aid agencies and every institution that has its country level presence and their specific people and specific interests. And how do you think we can get better at managing that both complex array of disunited demands, but also just an expectation that they are the policy setters and not those at the local level?
Well, yeah, a difficult question. It will depend or depends on the context. And at the beginning, it's difficult for the recipient or government to bargain, or is not in a position to bargain or enforce or impose something. And so the process seems to be donor-driven. So as for whenever we are talking about international policy response, we are talking about certain rules that the international community will, or donors will respect, including one of them would be the establishment of a parallel public sector. That's the question. And there is an argument, or one would argue that in the absence of popular demand by the recipient citizens, accountability, upwards accountability to donors is much better than the absence of accountability or demands. And that could be valid as far as the concern is with building public financial management systems, promoting transparency and accountability mechanisms. But the concern with that line of argument is that it's less likely that the donors and recipient citizens' interests are always and fully aligned.
So if they're not aligned, what do you do?
Well, the question is, who needs to do it? Because we got like a weak state, difficult to bargain, and we got fragmented or divided society, and we have the international actors who will have the final say. So here we need to rethink of the aid practices or the international practices towards situations of fragility. And if we expect like the recipient governments to act, I'm not sure about that. But and here in this case, it very much depends on the donors or the framework they're adapting.
Ashley Pollard, do you have anything to add to this? Nobody's raised the New Deal for Fragile States, which came out of Busan in 2011, which was hypothetically supposed to address some of this challenge.
I disagree with the premise. I think the leaders and elites of fragile states have more bargaining power than is often believed, mostly because donor agencies have an incentive to push money out of the door, right? And big fragile states is one of the few remaining places where you can have like 100 or 200 million pound program. Now, what does a leader do with that bargaining power is it's a local matter. If you talk to Paul Kagame in Rwanda about what he wants to do, he'll have some very strong ideas, and he will say no to donors a lot. But if you talk to Hamid Karzai, he'll maybe say, just give me the money, yes, 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 I'll promise to do whatever you tell me. So it's not the bargaining relationship, it's the elites, which means how are elites connected to society, who are they accountable to, how free are they to get away with murder when it comes to misusing public funds, whether they're aid money or not aid money.
Yeah.
Just want to distinction the question. One is how it ought to be and how it is in reality. What I mentioned about the reality, what's happening. And even let me give you the example of what's happening with off-budget funding. Even if some of the institutions are built, neither the recipient parliament, government, or citizens have any say. I was working on the national budget in Afghanistan, and when we were sending the budget to the parliament, we would distinguish between on budget and off budget. And it was clear that they didn't have any say about the off budget funded projects. So in practice, we can argue that the recipient should have the ownership, the leaders are playing key role. That's something we want them, it ought to be, but how it happens in the reality is concerning.
Who's signing those aid agreements locally?
Okay, let me give you the example. A donor is coming to a minister of, let's say, health. He's a strong minister saying, no, this is not my priority. So then what happens? That donor goes to another minister, will bypass you. The next time, your colleagues will say, it's a stupid decision, say yes. So that's how it works. But that should change. Yes. I gave the example, absolutely, that should change, and the locals should lead the process and own the process.
Ashley, do you want to raise anything on
Yeah.
this? Or we got a lot of hands up in the room, too. Go ahead.
Okay, I guess I'll just quickly also lay the blame at the feet of donors and not exercising self-restraint. And I mean, ultimately, if they're going to be institution building and reducing fragility and all these buzzwords and all these theories of change, then their actions have to line up with a theory of change that would result in a stable and capable state. And what you find is, especially in Afghanistan, they did repeatedly self-destructive, counterproductive, inefficient things that ultimately, as Nemat was just saying, they would go to the Minister of Health and say, we would like you to do this. Well, if you're Norway or Sweden or the UK, it's not really up to you to say how the health sector should run in Afghanistan. It should be all donors together with the Afghan government. And that's so rarely happened. So you ended up with a situation, you had, of course, Nemat mentioned the ARTF and the National Solidarity Program, but you had a situation by the time you got to 2014, then there was an effort to coordinate. Then there was an effort to put, 50% of funding on budget through mechanisms which were not direct budget support, but like trust funds managed by the World Bank and so on and so forth. So really, I mean, if donors want to talk about, encouraging states to be cohesive and bargain, they need to create the conditions to allow states to act in a unified manner and set policy for themselves, which just didn't happen in the early years in Afghanistan.
Great. I'm going to go over to the far section over here. There's a hand in the back that has something green on it, but that's all I can see.
Lizzie Hobbs from King's College. I just kind of wondered what implications actual electoral politics has on state legitimacy. How much you kind of think individual leaders have much salience on kind of general population's views, whether Ashraf Ghani is maybe seen as a little bit more legitimate than Hamid Karzai. Thanks.
Okay, and this gentleman right next to him.
Hi. Ashley made a really good point about how when you had political settlements, you were able to improve service delivery. And I was just wondering, what do you think the challenges are of aid acting as a platform to try and promote political settlements?
And then the last one just in the middle there.
Thank you. Marta Matosek, ODI. Could you please shed more light on the taxation in the context of the fact that economy in Afghanistan is majorly in shadow economy, and an extent to which, let's say, local warlords have impact on how the taxes are collected and where they are distributed? What kind of solutions do you propose to these challenges? Thank you.
Great. Maybe we'll start with you, Ashley, and then work back down towards Nemat.
I'll quickly take the political settlements one. I mean, I think that it's a phrase that I use a lot, and then a lot of people use a lot, and maybe we don't talk about what it means enough. But I would say in Afghanistan, political settlements, whatever that might mean, have huge implications for the delivery of aid. ARU, an Afghan think tank, together with the World Bank, did a phenomenal study looking at political settlements and how they affected healthcare and education delivery in Afghanistan. And what they basically found was that, and with NSP, you found this in communities as well. It's the community and local dynamics, the sort of the local power holders and where their interests lie, whether or not you have like a thin, top of the pyramid section of elites who have subjugated everyone else, or whether it's more egalitarian. You have to understand these things in order to design programming at the local level. And, I don't think those kinds of nuances were taken into account, even in the most successful programs like National Solidarity Program or the basic package of health services, which then lead to instances where it works kind of well and everyone's invested in it being a success, but there's massive capture in whole provinces or districts that doesn't get addressed because everyone's too afraid, A, to disrupt the narrative of success, or B, do the hard work of nuancing a massive national program to deal with, the localized constraints. And secondly, on political settlements, I just think, part of the problem in Afghanistan was everything was so technocratized. That's not a word, but everything was very technical and apolitical on the surface. And in the language, people talked about it, but everything was super political. And I think you have to come into the room with a political awareness of, okay, how, I have this great idea for institution building, but how's it really going to play out when Karzai has knitted together a government of sort of networks that he's beholden to? How is this really going to play out if I want to do subnational governance reforms or build a civil service? Am I really going to have a meritocratic civil service if that's a huge source of rent seeking? And I think those questions were deliberately ignored. So I think that's the higher level where political settlements as an idea could be used to challenge the way we sort of pretend that everything is a technical problem when in reality it's not.
I think that's been one of the big negative lessons of the experience with the New Deal for fragile states, actually. Paulo?
Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to comment very briefly on the political settlements question. I would say by and large, aid is, it supports or buttresses the existing political settlement, right? To the extent that most aid or rents are likely to be captured by the most powerful actors. That's also for good reason, because in theory at least, foreign aid is supposed to respect local ownership. So you're supposed to get the assent of local leaders, who are the elected representatives or the official representatives. For a donor to come in and say, I want to change your political settlement, that's going to be frowned upon, right, by everybody, even though the Nordics, with their pursuit of human rights, have to some extent tried to do that. But yeah, I don't think this is something that aid can do. Aid missions, aid projects, aid professionals are more likely to work with existing political settlements than try to fundamentally change them, unfortunately, which in Afghanistan it may mean working with some unsavory people or people who do not have the country's best interest in mind. The question about the elections, Samuel Huntington wrote about the two turnover test of democratization. He was saying that democratic consolidation happens when there's two turnovers between competing factions. Those are democratic turnovers, and they are respected. The outcome is respected. And I think that's as strong a rule as we have, a rule of thumb for democratic consolidation. To me, the most important thing is not that this president may be more legitimate than that president, is the fact that citizens, get back to the question of where are citizens, began to become invested in the system and take ownership and take pride in their institutions, not necessarily the factions. But that maybe is a different kind of accountability work that the international community can support in terms of educating citizens about their own rights, about their own institutions, about their own systems, and trying to make them, hold politicians accountable, such that when the inevitable president that tries to go beyond mandate limits or term limits, when that inevitably happens, citizens will be in an uproar against that. Citizens will protect the system over the individuals leading that. But to me, it takes time.
Thoughts on any of those three questions, Noah?
First, in terms of taxation, the share of tax revenue as percentage of GDP is the lowest in Afghanistan is 10%. But it started from 4%, so we can see lots of improvements. Well, but the major challenges, one would think that people in Afghanistan are paying less tax. That's not the case. They are paying different types of taxes, informal taxes, which we can call it extortion. When I did my field work, I sat together with one of the member of the business community, and we calculated the taxes they were paying. It would raise up to 60%, but the formal one was up to 20%. Because what's happening, the Taliban are coming and asking a household to pay tax. If not paying, they can cut off the electricity of that household. That's one example. Or whenever a truck is like passing a highway, someone will come, a militia group, and charge that truck. So that's also a type of tax, and corruption is another problem. But shadow economy, yes, or informal economy in Afghanistan is huge. How can we transition to a more formal economy? Is that we should keep the tax rate as low as possible to encourage them to come within the net of the state. But now the problem is the paradox again. Because of the pressure, the government has increased the taxation rate. It discourages people to come within the net of the state to pay taxes because there's no incentive. Coming to the issue of election, especially for the people who are, for those who study political science and the electoral process, we can see a distinction between two types of legitimacy. One is process legitimacy, and the other one, I would call it, or performance legitimacy. In the case of Afghanistan, we can make that distinction now, especially the current president is trying to build his legitimacy through performance, emphasizing on the reforms, making Afghanistan a roundabout of trade in the region. These are some of the elements or issues concerning with performance legitimacy. Whether achieved or not, that's a separate question. But in terms of process legitimacy, the electoral process, there has been problem. And so we need to distinguish these two. And some of the scholars, they argue that, I do not agree on that, but let me share the view with you that sometimes lack of legitimacy a blessing if the leader is then focusing on performance. We have cases of South Korea and Taiwan I have been studying, but it was just I shared, but it doesn't mean that I agree on that.
Great. We are almost coming to the end of our time, and in a very un-Afghan way, we actually have an event here in this room at 2:30 that needs to be completely reconfigured. So as we move to finish, we're going to close in about 5 minutes, and then I'm going to ask people, sadly, I wish we could all stay here all day and talk, but we're going to have to transition. So I'm going to take one or two more, and then I've got a couple of interesting questions from, I'm going to go to this side, has not had its chance last, gentleman in the back.
Yep, good afternoon. I'm Rupert Simons. My organisation is called Publish What You Fund, and we were set up by a number of people who used to work in Afghanistan. And the premise that they wanted to put to the test was that if you give the government better data on what the donors are doing, that will improve the government's bargaining position. Now, it seems to me 10 years later, that didn't quite happen, but something different happened, which is also interesting, which is there's more competition in the aid sector now. The Bretton Woods institutions are no longer the only game in town. An enterprising finance minister can raise loans from half a dozen different Asian and Middle Eastern jurisdictions without needing a sign-off in Washington, D.C. I wonder if you think if that enhances the accountability of the aid industry to the government, or it actually weakens it.
And then right here up front, the last one.
Hi, thanks. It's Maya King from the Blavatnik School of Government. Just noting that it's quite ironic that the donors are not paying any taxes when actually they're using state capacity arguably quite a lot, particularly in relation to their requirements, but also in relation to all the government officials who are trying to coordinate them and get information out of them according to the rules they set out and which donors don't obey. So it's just a suggestion that maybe donors should find a way to police themselves. One way is they make contributions, but there's a political aspect as well, because even if you have a lot of technical people in the aid management unit, if you don't have the political oomph to make that happen, then it's still an issue. So maybe one donor should recuse themselves from delivery and set themselves up and say, we're going to be the ones who are going to make this happen, and try and set up some hard sanctions so it actually matters to all the donors in the field offices whether or not they meet the government's requirements which are set out and which are enforced by the donor.
Thanks. And we had a question from UNDP Somalia, which I find fascinating. Zubair Izzat asks, says that any developing country should pay for their common and development budgets from resources generated and managed by the government. Efficient, transparent, and accountable governments are critical contributions, and critical contributions of the private sector are key elements to realize this. Can you share your perspectives? And we've talked a little bit about the private sector, and you talk about it more in your book, but it'd be interesting to bring that in. And then the last one is from Tripti, I'm not going to try the last name, from Global Giving, that says, I'm interested to know more about the panel's experience on community-led development initiatives and how local actors with or without external aid can give us some lessons in terms of donor-driven aid. In other words, maybe a third way out of all of this that we've been talking about is actually that communities are really the fundamental engine of a lot of the development that we're talking about, and as the state slowly grows and the donors do their thing, that's maybe where more of the focus should be. So with that, we're going to go to Ashley, Paulo, and last to Nemat. We only have about a minute each, but we'll give you the last word. So Ashley.
Yeah, I mean, I like the comment about donors, really. I mean, obviously, I sort of said something quite similar. I think Nemat makes a lot of really good points in his book, and I encourage everyone to read that. And we've had a really wide-ranging conversation. But if there's one thing I take from the lesson of Afghanistan is just how badly donors sort of exercised operational and strategic hypocrisy, how much their left hand, whether it was their military or their political hand versus their development, state building hands, undermined each other. I mean, really, the lack of coherence was, I think, one of the big downfalls. It wasn't even that what anyone was doing was bad, but as Nemat points out, the government didn't know. And if the government knew, maybe it could bargain. That's to say nothing of whether or not the government would have made the right choices in state building, but it should have really been on them, and it should have been on donors to be obligated to work together and create an environment in which the Afghan state could build its own institutions rather than sort of being alternately bossed around into doing various things and punished for being corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd leave it there.
Thanks. Paulo?
Donors are not monolithic entities. Aid organizations in particular are quite messy and sometimes silly, and the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. You know, somebody from one department attends a high-level panel on some big issue, and the country offices don't know about that. I don't think we have to put too many hopes on donors' ability to fix these problems, but that doesn't mean that they cannot be part of the solution because of the ability to muster technical know-how and financial capacity. All governments finance themselves besides taxation. Industrialized countries do it through access to private finance. Countries that are endowed with natural resources do it through natural resources. For those countries that have neither, aid is still a necessary resource in the meantime. So it is not, but I wouldn't trust donors to actually do as they say, because the people saying are not the people doing, basically. So I would encourage people to shift the level of analysis from the high-level debate to the practical implementation challenges, and to build that relationship between donor staff and local leaders and local communities.
Interesting. Final thoughts, Nemat?
Coming to the issue of private sector is key. Both for development and revenue generation and a state building process as well. And one of the question is that how can a state create like enabling environments for private sector development? Because if there is patronage and corruption, it undermines the development of private sector. We had few cases in Afghanistan. This is the biggest bank which failed, the Kabul bank. On the part of traditional or non-traditional donors, I think some of them are doing like a good job. Let me give the example of India and Afghanistan, because the focus has been on building key infrastructure projects which generated jobs and connected communities together, like, and also this electricity transmission line. And last but not least, but also donors somehow learned, now we can see a little bit shift in their approach, including USA, to what they are doing in Afghanistan. So a little bit more flexibility, working with the existing institutions, but yet it's a challenging process. And what above all we need is to have a long-term vision to exit from fragility and think of long-term development.
That's an almost hopeful note. We like to end at least with some thoughts about the future. So I'll take from that there has been some learning within the donor community. Clearly, a lot of people are focused on that, and testament to that is you coming here. And we really appreciate you coming today. Those of you who have joined us online as well, please continue the conversation inside and outside. And please join me in thanking our terrific panelists.